This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. My guest today, Peter Marks, is a staff writer for the Washington Post and has been that grand paper's chief theater critic since 2002. Prior to that, he was a reporter and theater critic for 10 years for the New York Times. His positions at the Times included a stint as a national correspondent covering the 2000 presidential campaign. Before that, he did stints at the Newark Star-Ledger and other New Jersey newspapers. Peter was a reporter and feature writer for Newsday, where in 1992 he was on a team of reporters that won the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting for coverage of a New York subway crash. He's co-author with the late AIG CEO Bob Benmosche of the 2016 memoir, Good for the Money, My Fight to Pay Back America, which is the story of Benmosche's life, culminating in his successful revitalization of the insurance giant that was hobbled by the 2008 financial crisis. Peter's writing has appeared in a variety of other American publications, and for several years he taught theater criticism in the honors program at George Washington University. Peter is co-host of the theater podcast Three on the Aisle with critics Terry Teachout of the Wall Street Journal and Elizabeth Vincentelli, a contributor to the New York Times. So it's an exceptional honor for me to have Peter Marks join me on StoryBeat today. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, pleasure is all mine, believe me. So you've been writing for quite some time now. When did you first start writing? When did you know you wanted to be a writer?
Well, it sort of happened right after college. I graduated from Yale in the late 70s and had entertained some thoughts of being an actor. I was quickly disabused of that. I was reviewed sometimes fairly critically myself as an undergraduate. And I started writing for newspapers in 1977 and have never not been employed by a newspaper ever since.
Wow. That's got to be something that's not all that normal.
Yeah, I know, and especially in this day and age, right? I look around at many younger faces in the newsroom, and I think, how did I survive every regime change at every newspaper that I've worked at? And there have been numerous ones,
and big ones, and important ones.
Indeed, totally. Very interesting.
So when you first started writing, were you writing? You didn't start out writing reviews, did you?
No, I didn't. I always loved the theater, and I didn't even entertain the thought of being a critic. I mean, my God, what an anathema that would have been for me at that age. No, I started covering local news for a newspaper in New Jersey. Night Meetings was my first beat in central New Jersey, and I worked my way up to feature writing, and eventually at the New York Times, where I was hired as a Metro reporter. In fact, the job of covering the theater as a news beat opened up in the culture section. I applied for that. I did that for about a year and a half when I was approached by an editor. There were some personnel changes going on in the criticism department, and he asked me if I had any interest in being a critic. And I can tell you, Steve, I had never really thought about it. And he said, "Why don't you give it a try?" And I did a couple of tryout reviews. I thought it'd be interesting. I submitted them to him and to Frank Rich, who was then the emeritus critic, famously, of theater at the New York Times. And they both liked them. And overnight, Steve, I was the number 2 critic at the New York Times.
That's pretty unbelievable, actually.
I know. It isn't supposed to happen this way, is it? I mean,
no, not You'd think they would have bring somebody in from some other huge paper to make their number 2.
Yes, exactly. You'd think it would be somebody who had, had studied, drama criticism for, 30 years and had been, aching to do this.
Mm-hmm.
But the ethos at the Times and even at other newspapers, which are sort of general interest driven organizations, was that, you could be the China correspondent one day and the theater critic the next. And in fact, Brooks Atkinson was a war correspondent.
Is that right?
During his tenure at
I
the
didn't know
New York
that.
Times. Yeah. Very famously. And so, there's a great tradition of finding people who can write on the topic, but not necessarily as, insiders.
Well, the other thing is there's a big difference between being in the business and then writing about the business.
True. Absolutely
those
right.
Are two different art
Absolutely
forms.
right.
And
yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I think that's absolutely true, and there is a great debate even within in both the art circles and in journalism circles about how much of an expert you need to be to write about a subject, and it varies from subject to subject. I guess the feeling is if you're covering the Supreme Court today, they like to have a lawyer do it many places, or someone who's got some legal grounding. But what really is essential to writing about the theater, to my mind, Steve, it's having a certain passion for it, because you've got to sit through it every night for most of the rest of your life if you're going to stick with it.
Yes.
And an ability to analyze and describe and put people who aren't there in the theater with you.
Well, you at least had some theater or entertainment background prior to doing it. And it wasn't like you came in as being the beat reporter at the Supreme Court.
That's right.
You knew it a little bit.
Exactly. I loved it, and I loved acting, and I dare say I know a lot more now than when I wrote those first reviews.
Of course. What did you study at Yale?
I was an English major. I studied in the English department. It was not a school that had a tremendously deep theater program. There was a theater studies major, which was a strictly academic major. There was almost no practical training undergraduate. There's no conservatory-like aspect to undergraduate education at Yale. But I took acting courses with Nikos Sakharopoulos,
yes,
who was a renowned director and acting teacher, ran Williamstown Theater Festival for many years, founded it and ran it. So there was, obviously, and he was connected to the drama school, which is one of the leading drama schools in the country.
Absolutely.
The professional school.
I've had two very excellent Yale grads on this program already, one being Phil Proctor from Firesign Theater and the other being Austin Pendleton.
Yeah, of course.
So,
esteemed. And interestingly, it's interesting, Steve, Point Park comes up, the theater program, I've always wanted to know a little bit more about it myself, where you're based, is because it shows up in a lot of bios, of actors who I review.
Last year, Point Park somehow got onto somebody's list of the top 10 schools that turn out people on Broadway.
I saw that. It's amazing.
It is.
There's some sort of secret sauce that's going on there, I think.
It's Pittsburgh. Well, we got CMU. We got CMU
exactly,
here
which
too.
Is a great, right, it's a great theater lab.
And I don't know if you've spent any time here, but over the years, the number of theaters in Pittsburgh have increased mightily, and they're outstanding. They're really, really good. And so I think that plays into it, because kids can come out of school here and start working here before they move off into the bigger cities.
It makes sense. And of course, one of my favorite playwrights, August Wilson.
Sure.
It birthed one of the great, or at least it nourished one of the great playwrights of the 20th century.
No question about it. Maybe the Shakespeare of our times.
Indeed.
So do you prefer the term critic or reviewer, or does it not matter?
That's a great question. I'm perfectly fine with either. Some people have very specific notions in mind when they use those two terms. I certainly try to perform both functions at time, and I think reviewer is what I'm doing on most nights, which is basically, being a professional member of the audience,
right,
and watching things that you don't get to see and or at least before I do, and describing them to you, to readers, but also performing the more rigorous, I would say, intellectually rigorous job of the critic, which is to synthesize, distill knowledge and history, and give context to what's happening in the theater in different kinds of pieces, maybe in essays and what we call critics' notebooks. So I don't really, I don't really distinguish between the two terms. It's my title is chief theater critic, but I'm also chief theater reviewer.
So for whatever it's worth, the connotation of those two words mean different things to me. I'm almost 50 years in the theater, and whenever I hear the term reviewer, I think, oh, this is going to be a nice, pleasant piece. And if I hear the term critic, I think it's going to be harsh. And
yeah, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, we're in this country, we're very ambivalent about criticism of any sort. And as you know, we've become more and more a country of laying on the encomiums. I mean, we the passing out laurels for everything, and people are very, very skittish about the idea of someone coming at you neutrally and therefore analytically, and possibly saying things that aren't going to please you. I think it's endemic in the culture now that this is the case. Tony Scott, A.O. Scott, the film critic for the New York Times, had a great line which I often quote when he was talking to an audience, and somebody in the audience raised their hands and asked him, "Mr. Scott, I read your reviews, and sometimes you're so mean, or you're so harsh. Why is that?" And he answered very quickly and said, "Because this isn't progressive kindergarten." and this is the point. We're paid here not to necessarily be the friend to everybody who walks in the door. And the critic, and if that does engender a sense of, the critic as someone who's, got their arms folded skeptically on their chest or her chest, and ready to render, a tougher opinion, then by all means call me a critic, because that's what I aspire to do.
Well, I think that we, those of us that do the art and then are reviewed or criticized, we always have a problem with the negative stuff, but the negative stuff helps us to move on to the better stuff. So
one would hope.
Well, that's true. One would hope doesn't always work out.
One would hope, and that's right. And I think that if you think of it that way, Steve, and that is a great way to think about it. It's my notion often is, even when I'm writing a harsh review, is I'm hopefully not only educating audiences or trying to help them understand what I saw, but also I do hope that sometimes artists will read that and say, well, he's not doing this to make us feel terrible. He's doing this because he's things that need to be improved. Mm-hmm. And if it's taken in that spirit, I think, many times it can be helpful. I think it often goes to the insecurity of the person who's being reviewed.
Theater people are not insecure.
No more so than critics are. Yeah, I know.
How many events or shows would you say that you wind up attending every year?
That's I would say somewhere. I count the bylines, and I realize, that even the bylines don't measure the number of things I see, because I see things that I don't end up reviewing for one reason or another. But I would say that in the neighborhood of 125 to 150 productions a year.
So 3 a week is essentially.
Yeah, I would say a third of my life is spent. A third of my days are consumed by theater going.
And mostly at night, or do you go to the matinees as well?
I'll go to. Sometimes there's no. I don't have any time but to see a matinee. Mm-hmm. So yes, I see matinees in November and April. It's way more than 3 times a week. It's maybe sometimes 5 and 6 times a week, which means on a weekend I can see 4 shows. I can go to 2 matinees and 2 evening performances.
So let's explain to the listeners why April and May it winds up being that way.
Well, April and November.
November. Sorry.
Yeah, April is in the nature of how theater seasons are created. there are two kinds. There are the nonprofit theater companies all over the country that set up a season at the beginning of September, and then it runs usually through June.
Mm-hmm.
And that's as opposed to Broadway, the commercial world of the theater, which has a separate schedule. But most of the time, theaters are opening shows in November to catch the holiday season.
Right.
Perhaps that's a big slot in the year. So somewhere in early November, shows start to open that they're expecting to probably be their big ticket show for the fall. And then again in April, it's to catch the spring rush. People tend to want to see theater, before the summer, which is which is changing, but traditionally a time when things taper off. So April is that big, usually spring production time. And then for Broadway, April is huge because the Tony Award deadline is May 1st or thereabouts. Right. for the nominations. And shows tend to push the envelope as far as they can to get close to that date to open a show, therefore, keeping fresh in the minds of Tony voters their production. And November being the time in the fall when the momentum of the fall season is really in swing, and therefore a lot of shows are opening up late October, November.
Of course, traditionally, the summers, it's always been too hot to even think about doing shows, but that has changed with air conditioning to a certain extent.
Oh, sure.
But that sort of tradition has remained, where the summer is a lot less active.
Indeed, there's still this sort of notion that people are away, they're not thinking about indoor activities. But I will say that the economies of scale for theaters and the use of space and the need to fill it as much as possible is changing even that. I mean, it's so expensive now to produce shows and run a theater that you really have to think about, income-generating properties all year round.
Oh, it has to be year round. They can't survive anymore. They're too financially burdensome otherwise.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the process of you going to review a show.
Mm-hmm.
Do you do, generally speaking, a lot of research about a show, or do you read the text prior to attending or anything like that?
Well, I have a couple of rules, Steve. One is, I do not read a play that has never been done before. If this is the first time or the second time it's being done in the world, I don't read it, because a play, I think, is meant to be seen the first time on its feet.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's intended. That's how theater is meant to be experienced, as a live experience, not as one with me gathering all my conceptions of these characters before I'm seeing them on a stage. So for a new play or musical, I do not look at a script. For an older play, for a revival, for a classic, I often, if I don't know it well, will look over the text, because the whole point of a revival is, what is this director bringing to it and this cast that no one else has tried to before? Why now for this piece to come back? Is there some very good rationale for it being done right now? So I will sometimes do that. And then there's a third category, which is adaptation. If you are so for something like I'm right now rereading To Kill a Mockingbird,
right,
because it's coming to Broadway in a very big, lavish production, and it's been newly adapted by Aaron Sorkin of West Wing and Social Network fame. So I want to see what he's taking from that book, from that novel, from that source material, right, and making it his.
Right. There's no question that's and a lot of what you see on Broadway now are adaptations of this, that, or the other thing.
Totally, and many from movies to musicals.
Mm-hmm.
It is. There's a tremendous emphasis on sort of brand awareness, I would say, going into a theater, because ticket prices are so.
You may know that I'm associated with one big adaptation that was a hit, though the critics didn't think so. I created Jekyll and Hyde the musical.
Oh my God! Sure. I can summon memories instantly.
I'm sure you can.
Of Robert Cuccioli.
Yep, that's correct. I was Frank Wildhorn's writing partner for 10 years.
Oh, my God, Steve.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I should have. I didn't. I knew that, and then I didn't know that somehow.
Well, that's quite all right. Most people don't, and that's just fine by me. As long as the checks keep cashing, I'm okay.
Exactly. Yeah, the best revenge, I would say.
So yes, indeed. So when you go to the theater, how do you remember things? Do you take notes in the dark? Do you have how do you take notes?
I either have a pad in my lap and always holding a pen. Sometimes I just write in the margins of programs because I know a piece so well that I don't really think there's going to be all that much need to take notes. I take less notes than I used to. I used to be a little bit more a little more committed to doing that. But I do find that if I have a pen in my hand, I feel like I'm on the job. It's I'm at work. As much as it is, I'm trying to experience what I'm seeing. I'm also conscious that my job is a little different than everybody else or most everybody
of course,
else.
But do you have a good enough memory where you can remember what you want to say later?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the only thing I don't have a good memory for, obviously, are the exact wording of lines, which I might want to quote in a review.
Mm-hmm.
The helpful thing that happens now is that for most shows we see, once you've seen the show, the production will supply you with a script. So if you wanted to, just make sure, refresh your memory.
Sure.
You've got something to use as a basis. But yes, I have developed I would say a muscular sort of function in my brain is I can retain the things about a show that I need to. I've trained myself to do that over the years,
mm-hmm.
so it doesn't really fade. Colors fade, so I need to write those down if I see something and I'm going to describe it. Costumes are often something that you have a visual memory of, but isn't quite necessarily recorded perfectly. So I try to get that, or to look at, obviously consult production photos. So there are elements of the physical production that I won't absolutely have right, and I will double check. But I can remember most important, Steve, is the sensation I've had at any given moment, my gut at any given moment of a show.
Mm-hmm.
I can recall that very, very, very specifically, and that's just something I had to do thousands of times.
So you have what I call a good memory for visceral reactions.
Absolutely, I can bring that back, and one of the things I try to do when I'm writing is summon that feeling. Pause, summon that feeling, and hope a word will float up or a phrase that will encapsulate what that is. Sometimes it works, sometimes it's harder, just because it's a little more elusive, the whatever the effect of that show was for me.
Mm-hmm. And to me, that's what makes a show. A show is when it does hit you in the gut. I mean, that's
exactly. No, it's absolutely unmistakable. It's kind of it's fail safe for me. If I have a strong gut reaction to something, I find it and I'm sure writers of all stripes have the same feeling. When something hits you powerfully in any way, you can bring that right back. You can bring that into words.
Well, sure, and hopefully the same is for the audience, and that's, I think, why some shows run as long as they do.
Totally, of course. But my job is to find those words immediately.
Of course,
I don't have time to. I don't have time to sort of like ruminate particularly. It's got to come to me as I'm writing.
Mm-hmm. So when you first started to review, did you start in the day and age where you went to the theater and then rushed back to meet the deadline that night?
No.
So you're
that day had already passed. I started in the 90s, and I'd say probably by the early 70s that world had disappeared from American reviewing.
Mm-hmm.
It's still the case in London. They still do overnight reviews.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's a different tradition. They write shorter reviews. They have people who write on Sundays, who usually do longer pieces in England. But no, we have anywhere from my practice as a reviewer for the Washington Post is if I see a show on Sunday night. It's going to go in the print edition Tuesday morning. So I will write on Monday morning. So if I see a show Sunday night, I come home, I get up early, I write between, say, 7 a.m. and 10 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
I file the piece. It will go online on Monday as soon as I'm finished basically, and my editors get through it, and then it will go in the paper on Tuesday. So that's the time. New York is a little different because they, as you know, they give critics a choice of dates of preview performances before what we call the opening night, which is some people don't understand that that's not the first performance.
No.
Opening night comes sometimes several weeks after previews have been running, a designated night on which the reviews will all run. So I'm usually going to a show at least sometimes a week before my review will appear for a Broadway show.
Right. And okay, so now once you've seen the show and you have in your head what things are all about and how the performances are and so on, text and et cetera, and you start to write your review, about how long does it take? About 3 hours in total to write every review?
Yeah, I would say. Sometimes what I do is the night I get back from a show, if I feel strongly enough, if inspiration strikes, I will start to write a lead for the piece that night, and then I will go to bed. I will just have a lead in the computer, just the lead paragraph, and in the morning it just it makes it that much faster because, as you know, of course, anybody knows once you've got a path.
Yeah, well, sure. Once you know what the goal of the piece is going to be, it gets a lot easier.
Yes, exactly.
Same thing, by the way, for writing the show.
Exactly. No, yes, exactly. It's a guideline for any kind of writing, I think, except that ours is so linear. I can't write the next paragraph until I finish the prior one. That's just my neurosis. It has to all come. And usually structurally, I've done this so many times, I don't really have to go back and refine much. Once I know where I'm going in my head, I can barrel right through, and it takes me anywhere from I would say 3 hours is the perfect sort of benchmark.
And do you so you're saying that when you write the review, you're not doing a ton of revision to it after the fact?
Correct. I try and read it. I try to read it through a couple of times afterwards. Although I find it more and more painful to have to read my own writing. I don't know how you feel about that, Steve. But and one of the problems of the modern age is that newspapers have been trimming staff, and one of the things that got trimmed greatly was copy editing. So you have to be much more. You have to be much more close. You have to be a much closer reader of yourself than you ever had to be before. There are still copy editors who catch mistakes, but I have found also that a wonderful thing about being published online before the print version goes to press is that people will notice. If you once you post it, people will email you or point out spelling errors or verbs that don't agree or mistakes in the spelling of actors' names, and you can correct them before they get into print. So the world becomes your editor.
The world has changed in so many ways, that being among the bigger ones. And and truthfully, the world is now one giant pot of critics. Just most of them don't get paid for it.
I know, it's true. Very few people in America get health care as a result of reviewing plays.
Exactly,
it's absolutely
right.
True.
And I think, thank goodness that's true, because the people that should be reviewing should know what they're doing. But everyone seems, if they've got a computer and they're on a social media of some kind, they're a critic.
I agree. That's absolutely right. Although I will say that, I think we're all coming to understand it's a completely evolving process that, 140 characters or 280 characters is not a review. It's an opinion.
Yes, it is.
And there is something different, regardless of how people accept it and whether or not we're going through some phase where people will reevaluate how they, what they want in terms of other people giving them their voice. That developing an argument is very different than just blurting out what you think.
Well, I think that's exactly the way it is. Do you think of reviewing? I mean, obviously you're looking at nonstop one story after another. You are really dwelling in the world of story. And do you think of writing reviews or criticism as a kind of storytelling in and of itself?
If I stop and think about it the way you describe it, yes. I absolutely do, because I think of storytelling in the way in which I'm approaching it is very much a shared experience. I don't think of myself as sending my thoughts into the world as a one-way street. I think of myself as bringing people along with me on this journey into the theater. And if I'm doing my job well, I am conjuring aspects of what I've seen in all kinds of ways. In the sensory experience of a review should have many layers. One of them being visual, one of them being perhaps emotional, one of them being psychological, and they are the elements of any good story.
Absolutely.
And I don't think length necessarily dictates, how much story you get to tell. A really tightly written 600, 700-word review, even shorter, can have a beginning, middle, and end that where you start someplace and you end someplace else.
Do you think of so for instance, one of the things I teach screenwriting at Point Park, and one of the things that we talk about all the time, nonstop, is about structure. Do you think of your reviews as being structured in a certain way?
I guess if I looked and I taught reviewing and tried to give what I called students a roadmap to how to write a review, because they needed those sort of guideposts, those mileposts in the writing. So yes, I have certain rules that I follow in the process of writing, but many of them are more intuitive, I would say, than specific, than concrete. But one of them is, very clearly, is that my job is not to tell your story by revealing much in the way of plot. I have to do my job by not doing that, by giving you the barest sense of what the story that you're going to see is doing. My job is to answer the bigger question of what the show is about in capital letters. What meaning we derive from this show, and I don't think that requires a little more, I think, in the way of nuance in terms of structure. That could change depending on the kind of review I'm writing. I've even done reviews in verse.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, you try to, not many, but I saw a show that was a wonderful David Ives show that was all in rhyme couplets, and I did a review in rhyme couplets. I was dared to as I left the theater that night by a theater goer who said, I dare you to try to review this in rhyme couplets, and I did. And so, playing with the form is one of the ways in which you keep it fresh for yourself and hopefully for other people.
Well, so you've obviously seen lots of plays and musicals. What for you at this point, and this may be a hard question to answer, what
Sure.
for you makes a good story good? So that listeners can get a sense of, reviewers coming to see my show, I know that I want to write and develop something that is a good story. Do you have a sense of what that is?
God, if I had a good sense of what this is, I wouldn't be doing this. I'd be, if I had I'd be at my computer right now, with the producer breathing over my shoulder. I mean, I know it when I see it, and you do too.
Sure.
I think it has. I would say that some of the elements for me, I'm thinking of some of the shows, the varied shows that I've seen that have really worked for me. I think that, a richness of character, something where these people feel authentic, beyond the boundaries of the story in which they exist is one thing. I think that novelty in terms of how you tell the story and what subject you choose as the core of your story. I think also having a clear sense of what you're trying to say is really essential and sometimes lacking. I think a knowledge of what's come before too is really important to understanding what an audience needs from a new piece of drama or a musical theater. Those things all feel to me, essential, and I can and we all can smell. I think we all have that same visceral response, or not everybody, because we don't all agree. But I think we all can find those things. We know when that sense of that spark of originality is happening in front of us.
I like to tell people, or my students really, that we are all, at some point after you've watched so many different shows and read books and gone to movies and so on, after a while we become master story watchers. We may not be able to break something down and tell why. That's your job. You break things down and tell us why. But audiences innately know when things work and don't work. They know in their gut. And they're masters at it, even though they don't have any academic facility for it.
Totally right. I think that's absolutely true. It's why one of the sort of, people often ask me, though, Steve, well, the audience loved it. Well, you wrote this negative review. You had all these problems with it, and the audience, went wild for it. And of course, and then they'll say, you didn't see the same show I did, and I will say, of course I didn't. I'm not you. We all bring a different set of expectations and experiences to a show. There is no way I trust the rest of the audience to tell me what I think. I can see sometimes what they think. And certainly the experience of the writers of the show and the actors in the show have a different experience than I do of what the audience gives them. So I don't find that as a healthy barometer for me to how I respond to a show, because, after all, an audience still is made up of, 1,100 individuals.
Sure. Do you think that the business that you're in, let me give it a better spin. Do you think that the business that you're in of criticizing, reviewing shows has changed dramatically in the time that you've been doing it, or is it pretty much the same? Or how's it changed then?
It's changed. My process hasn't changed particularly. I mean, I still have the same inner sort of experience of theater going that I always had. That hasn't changed so much, but the external influences and the way in which they all interact has changed dramatically. The key one being, of course, social media and the interaction that promotes. And I have to be, as a reviewer, open to many more points of view being sent back at me after a review runs than I ever had before. When I started reviewing in 1996, I think, you wrote a review, it went in print, and, you went to the next show. You got, maybe a few letters from people, but they arrived a week later, and you might hear from a couple of people on the phone. But now it's instantaneous, and it comes from, people with, you've never heard of, or who even have, names that are disguised online, or they're on Twitter or on Instagram or in Facebook, and you have to sort of decide how much Russian. You're going to engage with them.
Or they're Russian.
Or they're bots. Exactly. Oh, if there were theater bots, I think, that would be an interesting development. If that would really signal, we're in the mainstream of American culture, I think.
That would be very interesting if they discovered that all this criticism of the critics was actually being generated elsewhere. So it's different in that way. It's also different, Steve. Let's be real. Our reach is more limited. I think in some ways our impact can be very extensive, given a new writer or a new talent, and we can help promote that. But on these big shows that come rumbling through town, they have. They're not, no one's paying that much of attention to what I'm saying about it, I think. And certainly, in Broadway is now upwards of 70% tourist driven. Sure.
They're not reading. I don't think that's a particularly review intensive readership for theater.
Well, it's interesting. The shows on Broadway run because people have heard about them, not necessarily that they've read a review, because it might be 4 years after a review ran. So they've got to go seek it out if they're interested. And so it has more to do with word of mouth and sort of that sort of reputation than a show. Now, it used to be that a single critic could shut a show down after its opening night. That's less true today, is it not?
Correct. I agree completely. And that's healthy. I mean, as all things, why should one person why should one person's point of view have that kind of clout? I mean, it is
agree.
a little bit, it's a little crazy. And who needs that kind of pressure in their life? I mean, who wants to really have that the job of closing shows?
Well, that's absolutely right. Why would you want that job? I don't know.
No.
It feels like
I think any sane person wouldn't.
I think that's there's a lot of people that like that kind of power. I think that's what it winds
I guess. I guess. I think of the people I know though who do this, Steve. I would say it's yes, of course you want to have clout. You want to be considered someone who people take seriously.
Right.
But in terms of that level of, my word goes, and yours doesn't count as much. Very few people in this business anymore of what I do think that way.
So, all right, back to new plays. I'm curious about new plays and musicals that when you go to see them,
Right.
Is there a way that you approach them differently than a show that you've seen before? Because I assume you've seen many shows numerous times.
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I know the history of these other shows, their record of success or failure,
right?
And that gives me a sort of a guideline for understanding, how much of an impact these pieces have had before. Some of them, often though, I also have an emotional connection to pieces I've seen before. With new plays and musicals, I don't. I may have some connection emotionally to somebody who's involved in the show, and by emotionally, I mean like their work before, want to see them succeed, interested in seeing what they do next. So those things can play a part in how I approach something, and also obviously in terms of the respect I bring to seeing their newest work.
Mm-hmm.
The hardest part of watching a musical, of course, is there's so many component parts.
Right.
To a musical. There's so many things to observe that you want to make sure that you're giving as much attention to the technical aspects of what's been put on the stage as you possibly can, as well as to the overall aesthetic effect.
Right.
And on top of that, a passel of songs that you've never heard before,
mm-hmm.
and you've got to integrate these all into your head, not only as a theater goer, but also as someone who's got to say something smart about it,
right.
which is a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work, and can be, if you thought about it too much, you probably go out of your mind. So you put that away and you try to just experience it as a regular person.
Are you good at?
Yeah.
I was going to say, are you good at understanding lyrics the first time you hear them?
Yes, I am. I can tell. Although I will say that on a second, third hearing, I get much more out of
course,
out of what I'm experiencing. So I can hear if we're in the world of doggerel. I can hear if if we've got somebody who's listened to Sondheim all their lives. I do have a sense of, and I also have a sense of whether these characters are singing like the people they're supposed to be, or they're just singing, like a college educated music major from the 2005.
Right.
Those things do occur to me. I have a little more. I need a little more help, I think, with the sort of the influences in the music and hearing, and certainly things like orchestration. You get like a very superficial sense from one hearing of this very complex part of a show, which can often have a huge impact on a piece of theater.
No question.
And with plays, it's a little easier just because you don't have that many elements competing for your attention. But what I go by mostly, Steve, ultimately it's my gut, and I have this, what to me, feels infallible. I don't think anybody else would necessarily think, view it that way. But for me, if I'm, there is an ability to let a piece of theater wash over one, even as one is thinking about what one's going to say about it, and that's just from doing this, hundreds and hundreds of times, I think.
Sure,
and also having loved this form from the time I was 5 years old and saw Mary Martin in The Sound of Music on Broadway.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It comes through loud and clear how much you love this. This is in your passion for it and in your voice and how you speak about it. It's absolutely abundantly clear. This is not a.
I'm glad.
It's not a. Does not sound like this is drudgery for you to go to another show. You like it?
No, it's wonderfully. Yes, exactly. It isn't. That's a great way to describe it. Getting, as you get older and do this more, getting to the theater feels more like a chore. Having to, fight crowds and make sure you're there on time and worry about those things. Those things have an impact. But once I'm in that seat, that all goes away.
Mm-hmm.
And it is like being, 12 years old again, and just, such a familiar feeling of expectation and hope. And maybe a little more skepticism than I had when I was 12, I like to believe.
Do you still get excited?
What?
Do you still get excited at shows? Do you still get excited to see things?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, of course. I mean, there's a thrill. I can't not feel that. I mean, some nights it goes away very quickly. It dissipates in the first 5 minutes, and I'm like, oh dear, this is not going to happen tonight for me.
I know. I've been there and done that.
Yeah, we all have. So it's not always a, but sure. Oh my God, I have it all the time. I think about going to see a great play, and it's it's completely a renewable resource in my brain.
Wasn't that a wonderful thing to be in a career that happens?
Oh my God, no! Yeah, exactly. Anytime I get jaded and that feeling of I'd rather be home watching Netflix tonight, I have to pinch myself and say, this is a privilege.
And it doesn't cost you anything to get in.
Exactly, which some people are surprised by. People think that we should be paying for every ticket, and I think in an ideal world we would.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth of the matter is that news organizations don't have the resources for that,
mm-hmm.
and we would probably review a lot less stuff if that was the case.
Oh,
and
no
that
question.
And I think that most theater people would mourn that. They really actually do want to be reviewed.
Oh, it's a love-hate thing for theater people. They need you, but at the same time they fear you, and at the same time they love you when you write well about something, and they loathe you when you don't. So,
indeed, it's all understandable. It's completely just human nature.
Mm-hmm. It is indeed. Do you decide which shows you're going to go see, or does someone else decide that for you?
I'm in the fortunate position as the chief critic to set my own agenda. Some of that is very self-evident. There are things that obviously I'm going to go to, both in New York and in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is some sort of what I would call elective theater going, which are things that maybe I just want to see and review that I don't necessarily have to. I probably do more than I need to, but that's just from personal preference and how I want to do the job. And but no, I basically set out what I'm going to see. The only place that it becomes a judgment call is what productions that I see in New York are going to make it into print in the Washington Post. That's all the shows I see in Washington are going to make it in.
Right.
But just in terms of space issues, some of the New York things I see, particularly off Broadway, I have a little harder time convincing that they should be done anywhere but just online.
Do they not? Does the Washington Post not run reviews online that they would not then put into actual print?
No, they will run print only. They will run online only reviews.
Online only. They do run online only.
Yes, they do run online only. It's. I would say that's more the exception than the rule. Though.
I see.
There's much. They endeavor to put as much in print as they possibly can.
Mm-hmm. So,
but some things just if there's just an onrush of arts events and and political events that have to go in the style section of the Post because we share an art section with feature writers and political feature writers, and that's the space is limited.
Of course, and more limited all the time as advertising shifts, and so it really has changed. The print medium has changed drastically, and online has changed drastically in the last 20 years.
Totally.
What show would you say you have seen more than any other?
I have probably seen more productions of King Lear.
King Lear.
King Lear.
Oh my goodness!
Is probably yes. I know you didn't expect me to say that. I guess.
Oh, I did not.
I would say the King Lear. I have probably seen 25 to 28, something in that range of King Lears in my life.
Oh, wow.
In my job, it's just any classical theater worth its salt wants to do it, and every actor of a certain age wants to do it. That combination makes it something that is a perennial. It's very rare that a season goes by that I don't see King Lear at least once.
That's wild, because that's a long show.
Say that again.
I'd say that's a long
show. There's a particular connection that a lot of theater goers, serious theater goers, feel towards King Lear, and what it says, the depths of its wisdom about aging and parenthood that really connects with people.
It's very, very deep. So is there a favorite Lear of yours? Is there one that stands out?
We were talking, oddly enough, Steve, this is something that, when theater critics get together, sometimes they talk about. I mean, obviously other people do too. I saw a Lear, surprisingly enough, the best Lear I ever saw, maybe surprisingly to you, was by American actor Stacy Keach. And I saw him play the character with such a deep level of commitment to Lear's sort of bewilderment at what was happening to him, that it was so poignant and so stunning that it really stood out for me. That this was the sort of the core of this man was his cluelessness about what he had set off, what he had ignited in the world, and that sort of merged with his own sort of growing dementia as the play goes on, and that it became so poignant and so terrifically portrayed that it's always stayed with me.
I would say he's among the better actors that we have who is perhaps not usually recognized as such.
Exactly right. That's a very good characterization. I want to find something to disagree with you on, Steve, but you're making it difficult.
Sometimes I get lucky.
I'm trying to show how contrary I am, and it's not working.
Well. Okay, I'll take it.
Good.
So, is there when you go to shows over and over like Lear, is there some technique that you use, psychological technique, where you go, oh, here I go again, I'm seeing the show again, and how do you have some way to get through perhaps seeing a show for a fourth or fifth time that maybe you found distasteful all along?
Well, it's different. That's a great question, and it's different for Shakespeare than almost anybody else.
Of course.
Because you can go to Shakespeare, the same play, 15 times and never hear the same play. There's just something about the variety of and the just the range, the spectrum of thought and wisdom and emotional depth that directors and actors can find in Shakespeare, that you're always, every time I go, I can hear something new. I hear a line a different way, and that sort of illuminates a character in a way I never thought before. So it doesn't really, that's really not a problem. It's more like, the eighth time I've seen, and with some American musicals, I can see them over and over again and see different things. I think, I think the more problematic musicals become the more interesting ones, one like Carousel, which I've seen numerous times, and each time sort of came that way with something else, and that really helps. And then there are other musicals that I find that on repeated seatings become triter and triter, and you find more and more of the problems with them. I think of a musical like How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, which I once really loved and now I really dislike, just because of the portrayal of women, and I think it's it's an insoluble problem with that show. So I'm changing too when I see these things, and I have to remember that none of us is who we were 10 years ago, and certainly the world has changed and changed the context for how we see these things. So it's rare that I have to go. That I go into one of these shows and feel like I'm seeing exactly what I saw before, because they change.
Well, how wonderful is it that you can, in the theater, and only in the theater, can you go to see a something produced that is of the same text that you saw somewhere else and it be totally different.
Right.
As opposed to a movie that you might see repeatedly. And there's only one movie I can think of in my experience that every time I see it, I learn something new in it, and that's Citizen Kane.
Ooh, that's a good one. That's, of course. And that is, I mean, and interestingly enough, Wells was a theater man himself.
Sure.
So that really makes sense that he created that kind of work on film. And I know what you mean. I go for it, when I see old movies that I've loved, I do tend to rekindle the emotions that I felt the first time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have, and that's what I go for. I really do go to have that, wash over me the same way as it did.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but that's really interesting. Yeah. I can't think of and that's a great one to choose. And I can't think of one that has that for me, that the way that works the way theater does.
Because in the theater, you're getting to see somebody's giving it a different spin. They're coming at it differently. They're putting up different costumes and sets and lights, and the actors are different, and the way the lines are delivered is different. So theater keeps fresh that way.
Yes, absolutely.
And the worst for me is that once I've seen a movie comedy, it tends never to be funny again. There's only one comedy I've seen many times that I laugh at every single time, and that's What's Up, Doc? It's the only one.
That's interesting. I was wondering what you were going to say. For me, the one that there are two or three that are renewable, and interestingly, they're being turned into musicals. One of them was Groundhog Day, which I've always loved, the Bill Murray movie, and the other is Tootsie, which is going to be brought to the theaters to the theater in New York as a musical this spring, and they just. I marvel at just the genius of the mechanics. They always get me.
Well, what a shame that Larry Gelbart isn't here to translate it to Broadway.
I know.
He's one of the great both theater and movie geniuses of all time.
Totally, absolutely right. So he did a great. I think didn't he do Sly Fox?
He did.
Wasn't that his?
That was his. Yes, yeah. Sly Fox. He did. I think it was called Movie was a play.
Yes, right.
He was and of course, funny thing happened on the way to the Forum.
Right.
We sometimes forget that was Larry Gelbart.
Yeah, exactly right.
So we're coming toward the end of the show,
yes.
And I can't tell you how much fun this has been. This has been great fun for me.
Same here.
Well, great. So I'm wondering, in your long experience at doing this, have you've probably had at least one oddball or quirky or weird or funny experience. Do you have one that you might be able to relate to us?
Well, I can, Steve. I was thinking about this in terms of before talking to you, and it actually occurred to me because it really does go to what a critic does and the weird ways in which the world thinks they're supposed to try to influence a critic. I have had experiences in the theater where it is apparent to me that the person who's been seated next to me or across from me has been instructed to behave in a way that's going to make me think they've enjoyed this show so much that I have to enjoy it as much. And I don't know if it's a friend of the producer or, usually it's someone I can't even identify. They're just anonymous, but they're laughing louder than everyone else, or they're crying, more copiously than anyone else. It's just, it's like sometimes better than the theater I'm watching on the stage. So one time it was on Broadway. I was writing for the Times, and it was a new sort of compilation musical about the life of the composer of Moon River, and his name is Johnny
Mercer?
Anyway. Yeah, Johnny Mercer. It was and so I'm sitting there, and there's a man sitting there. I didn't even look. I was, had my nose on this, glued on the eyes glued on the stage, and he kept nudging me and saying, literally nudging me and saying, "Is this not the best show you've ever seen?" He said it to me in intermission, and I finally I looked up, and it was Soupy Sales.
Oh, wow.
Do you remember Soupy Sales?
Oh, of course.
They put Soupy Sales next to me to try to make me believe that this was a much better show than I was seeing.
Oh, aren't you lucky you didn't get a pie in the face?
Exactly. I was, and I had, and I basically I looked at him and I said, "Soupy Sales? What are you?" It was so bizarre to me that this would, but he was clearly told to Soupy Sales is endorsing this show. The New York Times Critic will definitely like it more if you tell them you liked it.
Oh.
So I have always had my Soupy Sales rule. If you're laughing louder than everyone else in the audience and you're sitting next to me, you're conjuring Soupy Sales for me.
Well, I'm trying to imagine the thinking involved that went into, hey, if only we could get Soupy Sales to sit next to this reviewer. What kind of thinking is that?
I have, I think he's passed on. So Lord, God rest his soul. But yes, I'm not always so sure that producers are thinking clearly when they're worrying about what the reviews are going to say. So and sometimes probably their publicists can't persuade them that that's not a good idea. But I will say that when they do that, it makes me think that they don't have much faith in what they've got on the stage.
Well, that's right. That's very well right. Although occasionally it works, as in the case of Frank Sinatra, where his early productions or early performances, they put ringers in the audience screaming. So that turned into Sinatra. That. Of
course. See. So so maybe I have been more deeply affected by Soupy Sales all these years than I don't know.
Wow, yeah. I hope that you don't want that to be your legacy. Trust me.
No, exactly.
So do you have a single piece of advice or a tip for those that are starting out either in show business in general or as reviewers or critics that would help them along the way?
I think that the best advice I could give to people is if you want to, I think that, for me, it's the idea that the form I'm writing in is going to survive in some way beyond 280 characters, and I would say that for anybody who wants to review theater or movies, is the world gives you, the wonderful thing the world gives you right now is a platform, whether it's 10 people, you're just your friends reading you, or many, many more than that. And the idea is to write about everything you see. Just to go and start and read the people that you like who are reviewing. Try and figure out what the things about what they do inform what you think about the world, and set it out in blog form or in a Twitter thread or whatever way it works for you. But start writing and write a lot.
Such good advice that I share all the time. The only way to become a great writer is to write.
Correct.
You can't buy your way to it. You have to do it.
Exactly.
That is extremely valuable advice. Peter, this has been such a great show. I'm so happy you came on today, and so much wonderful advice, and your experiences are just fantastic. So I thank you.
Well, I thank you, Steve. It's great to talk. You make me love the theater more just hearing your enthusiasm. So I appreciate the interest.
Well, and again, that's kind of you to say, and I'm very grateful for my years of doing it. So thanks again. And so we've come to the end of today's Story Beat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.